Hello, my name is Visklugers and welcome to a tutorial video on what ammunition should you use in which kind of situation and how some of the armors work. Now this will be separated into two different videos, and this first video will be about the ammunition, what loadout should you take and what are the actual differences of different ammunition types. And the second video will be all about the different armor protection systems and stuff like that. So with the ammunition. This is your ammunition loadout screen. You can access it by clicking here or going through here. So you can click and drag however you want your ammunition to be in your vehicle, and by pressing 2 you will get this HE ammo, by pressing 3 you will get these guided missiles in the game. So you can swap the position of different ammo however you feel fit. Generally I like to have the ammo that I mostly use on the first slot, so it will automatically load when the game starts the ammunition that I most likely want to use. And I tend to put the guided missiles, if the vehicle has any, on the last spot, so that I won't accidentally choose the missiles if I want to switch to HE or a heat round. Now let's discuss about the different kinds of ammunition. What kind of different ammo are there in general? Now, the best place to see this is on the armor screen. You have ammunition that is categorized as armor piercing ammunition. And then you have high explosive based, and you have SC, which stands for shaped charge based ammunition. And the earlier vehicles and quite a lot of armored fighting vehicles do have steel armor or something else that gives just a flat armor rating to every single thing you fire at them. And even though, so it doesn't matter what type of ammunition you choose, the armor is the same. But if you would choose something bit bigger and more armor focused, you will see that the armor values do change depending on what kind of ammunition you shoot at it. So not all ammunition are viable options against certain vehicles. Now let's talk first about different kinds of ammunition that are based on armor piercing. Now, in general, the armor piercing rounds do have the highest speed of all the different rounds. Generally 1200 meters per second. Now some rounds can have higher speeds than that. The highest that I have found yet so far is 1500 meters per second. And why that is important, the higher the velocity of the shell is, the easier it is to hit a target, because you don't have to take so much lead. So it just simply makes the aiming process a lot easier thing to do. The longer the ranges become, the clearer the difference will be if you have a high velocity bullets instead of not having high velocity bullets. Now the second difference is that unlike HE and shaped charge ammunition, the armor piercing rounds can over-penetrate or overmatch the enemy's armor, which pretty much means that you have too much penetration on your rounds. So they will go inside the tank and right through and come out of the tank as well, doing minimal amounts of damage instead of detonating inside or just doing all sorts of havoc inside. And this will result in damage reduction. You won't make as much damage as you would normally do. Now, this is actually a factor because the armor penetration based rounds do have the highest amount of penetration, in exception of the guided missiles. But in general, the armor penetration rounds do have the highest armor penetrating values. So you would really have to be switching out from AP from time to time when facing armored fighting vehicles and light tanks. But you can, it is viable to only shoot AP. It's not like that the damage reduction would be a huge one, but it is there. So it kind of rewards you for using the right kind of ammunition. Now, the final big thing about armor-piercing rounds is that it has armor normalization going for it. Now, what that means is that when the shell hits the target, there are, in most of the tanks, angles such as this. Let's see if we can get angles such as this. So the armor is a lot thicker when it's angled heavily. So sometimes when your armor is on an extreme angle, it can automatically ricochet off without damaging the hull at all. So there comes in the angle normalization. Now the armor-piercing rounds have some normalization. It's not a huge, but it can be enough to normalize the angle enough so that your shells do not bounce and they actually go down a bit so that the angle is not so heavy anymore and they go right through the vehicle's armor. Now, for instance, heat shells do not have this characteristic and they will pretty much bounce every single time when facing heavily angled armor, such as this kind of here or this kind of here. Now moving on to HE based ammunition. There are various types of this kind of ammunition as well, and generally they do have extremely low amount of penetration, and unlike in World of Tanks, these kinds of ammo rarely ever penetrate. Now, in this, for instance, these rounds have 12 millimeters of penetration. So they have pretty much no chance of penetrating this AMX-10P, and it has notoriously horrible armor, but it's still not enough. Well, maybe we take a look at something a little bit bigger then. How about a 152 millimeter gun? Now it does also have only 22 millimeters of penetration, so that as well will struggle to penetrate an armored fighting vehicle which has next to no armor. So in extreme cases, such as something like a BMD-1 or BMP-1P, which have ridiculously low amount of armor, you can penetrate and then you will do a monstrous amount of damage. Now in this case, it's a maximum of 551 damage. Now if we check heat, it has 534 on average. So you can high roll higher with heat than you can high roll with HE. So the HE's magic, if you like, comes from the modular damage and the fact that it does not need to penetrate the armor. A gun such as this, which is a very high caliber, does always damage unless you hit somewhere like right at the end of the track and there's spaced armor behind the track as well or something like that. You will always do damage except in extreme cases, and you will always do modular damage. Also, you have higher chance of setting the engine on fire, which is great. And that is pretty much what the HE is for. It's for crippling the enemy, not so much doing direct damage, but destroying the modules inside, setting the engines on fire, killing the crew members, making the life of the opposing player like a nightmare. The HE-based shells have extremely low velocity in comparison to armor piercing. 500 meters per second is what they tend to have most of the time. Artillery tends to have 300 meters per second. So when shooting with an artillery, it actually takes a couple of seconds for the shells to arrive at your target. So the enemies will have quite a lot of time to actually dodge and move out of the way, especially since they get the warning when shot at with an artillery. But moving on back to regular HE. Now, because the shell explodes on impact and it doesn't rely on penetrating, it doesn't have any kind of armor normalization. So the 22 millimeters of penetration in this case is as far as it goes. So what I'd recommend with HE is that if you're facing like main battle tanks, just don't even bother unless you have a clear shot at the back of the vehicle or at the engine deck or something like that. Yeah, that's a really good place to go for, because you might not make a huge amount of damage even with a big gun, but you can set him on fire, destroy the engine, and then you make the enemy a sitting duck and destroy half of its modules. Then it's an easy prey for any of your allies, or maybe you just wait for your second shot to load in and then you can finish him off. But also, if facing vehicles such as these, you can very easily just put a shot here, maybe on the hull, on the top side of the hull, on turret, anywhere, it will just blow it away. But be aware of protective systems such as based armor, which tracks counts off, and these kind of side skirts and everything. If you shoot here, most of the damage is absorbed by the spaced armor and not by the vehicle itself. And a lot of the modular damage is lost pretty much because it doesn't penetrate and it doesn't splash the engine, it doesn't break the gun, it just blows off the tracks and they will be fixed pretty quickly. Now moving on to the final round type, which is the shaped charge. And there are a couple of different kinds of shaped charge, mostly heat-based and guided missile-based. And the heat shells are pretty much AP shells, except that they do not have any normalization, they cannot overmatch, they have higher damage in general, lower penetration, and half the speed. So sometimes when you shoot at a vehicle that such as like BMP-1, maybe BMP-1 is not that good of example, but some light tanks are pretty good examples. For instance, well, this is a tank destroyer which has just even a little bit of armor, but if you shoot in an extreme angle such as this, if you shoot from this camera angle here with an AP shell, it might still go through because of the normalization. But if you shoot with a heat shell, it has no normalization, it has less penetration in general, and it is very likely to just bounce off harmlessly. Or just, hit here and just pretty much explode outside of the vehicle, doing zero amount of damage. Now, that is a pretty big problem of the heat shells. But when they do connect, and for instance, most of the armored fighting vehicles do have very low amount of armor, so you can just spam heat at them and it will do monstrous amounts of damage. For instance, if two BMP-1Ps get a duel and you have around about 344 damage per shot, it will take a third of its total hit points per shot. So the heat is a really, really, really good damage dealing shot if you can penetrate it. And that's the trick. But you might think, oh, the armor penetration with the missiles are a lot higher than any other. In this case, 503 millimeters of penetration in comparison to the 192. Who on earth would rather shoot heat, or AP, than guided missiles? Now, the thing why guided missiles are pretty tricky is that you have generally a 1.5 seconds of priming time or waiting time. So you have to stay absolutely still. You can rotate the turret, but you can't move your tracks or wheels at all. You can't turn the tank, you can't move the tank forward or backwards. No, nothing like that. You can turn the turret, and that's about it. So you are a sitting duck whenever you wanna use the missiles. Also, the missiles have a lot longer reload times. In this case, you have to wait 20 seconds for the second missile to kick in, while the heat has only 6.67 seconds before you can shoot your second shot. So the DPM on missiles are generally horrendously bad. And the damage, well, it is better in this case than the heat, but in some cases it might actually be a little bit lower. And the heat shells tend to have a really bad velocity in comparison to the armor-piercing shells. Now, the guided missiles have a horrendous velocity even in comparison to the heat. Now, if the heat has bad, which is 750, the guided missiles have 200. So, as if the bad news wasn't enough here, the enemy will always get a warning if you shoot a guided missile at them. So they can easily duck behind cover and there's just no way of hitting them. And they can actually have quite a long amount of time to duck behind cover if you are a bit further away from the enemy. Now, this is balanced by the fact that they are guided missiles. You can guide them. You can, with the mouse cursor, when you shoot, you can point the direction you want the missile to go. So in theory, you can even change the target you were intended to hit. So it's like if you have a gun that has a horrendous accuracy, that is pretty much like a balancing factor. Because the missiles do not have accuracy, kinda. Because you can guide them with your mouse cursor, which is a kind of a good thing and a bad thing. Now, personally, I absolutely hate the missiles. They do have their kind of place when you want to use them. With the armored fighting vehicles such as the BMP-1 and BMD-1 and their other variants, they have a very good places when you use your main gun and then you pop one missile and maybe pop another one sometime later. But in the case of, for instance, the swing fire, which has the only option of using missiles, it is a ridiculously horrendous experience. Of course you can make it work pretty easily, but because you cannot move when you wanna shoot, if you get surprised, you're dead. If the engagements are short, you're dead. Now, the missiles have a good penetration, but in the case of, for instance, the T-64, which is a tier 4 vehicle, it has a 164mm of protection in the front, but because it's steel and fiberglass composite armor, its shaped charge protection is 308mm at the front of the hull. Now give it a little bit of an angle, and actually shaped charge ammunition that have 400mm of penetration can have a little bit of a hard time going through it. Even though at first it would seem like, holy shit, this thing has a fuck ton of penetration. But the countermeasures of different vehicles have gone beyond that amount of penetration, and it is actually quite hard to deal with. So what kind of ammunition should you actually use then? Well, it depends on the situation a lot. If you're facing lightly armored vehicles, light tanks that do not have a lot of armor, armored fighting vehicles that have next to no armor, tank destroyers that have next to no armor, all vehicles that do not have any armor to begin with. Heat shells do the maximum amount of damage. If you do want to take out the opponent as fast as possible out of the game, use heat shells. If you do want to cripple your opponent, damage its engines and so on, use HE. They will go through. If the HE goes through, it will pretty much obliterate everything inside the vehicle and do a living hell for the driver. So when you should choose to use AP rounds? Use AP rounds whenever the heat does not work. For instance, main battle tanks that have a high amounts of armor. You really do not want to be engaging with heat shells at the front. Missiles, maybe. High explosive, no. You can be extremely lucky and hit a place where it somehow does more damage than it usually does, than it usually should do. But really, if you want to make sure you make damage, choose the AP rounds. And go look for weak spots like the lower plate and the commander's hatch and the turret ring. The turret ring is something that is very weak on every single tank, and some tanks have it bigger than others. Now, the AP is something that some vehicles only have. The HESH or high explosive is something that the Chieftain, for instance, has in addition to armor piercing, but the HESH also has only 20mm of penetration. So that is a bit of a interesting situation. So I tend to just spam AP rounds at that stage, making it a little bit frustrating when facing off vehicles that have like none armor at all, for instance like Fox. And it takes actually a couple of shots to deal with the Fox cause it has so little armor. Now it would be far wiser idea to use high explosive or heat. But it is viable to just choose to use armor piercing shells. But what happens when you face off an enemy and your armor-piercing shells do not have enough penetration to go reliably through the front of the vehicle. Maybe the turret ring is very minimal and hard to hit. If you don't have any kind of missiles, and even if you would, there's protection against the missiles as well. Well, in that case, you are, while on 101, there's not a lot you can actually do. You can always try to find weak spots. Generally, all kinds of commanders' hatches and different things popping out of the turret, the lower glazes, the turret ring, the viewports. Those are the most general weak spot places of the vehicle. But don't take a bigger tank head on unless you have support. So what is always the hardest thing to do is to go through head on. Most of the time you will have to go through head on. But in any case, you really do want to go through from the side or from the rear, and that is pretty much self-explanatory, because the armor is so much lower from the sides and the rear. But in this case, well, the armor is, from the turret at least, quite similar, yes, but the angling is here a lot bigger than here, so it's always a better idea to shoot at the side of the vehicle. Try to have some kind of team play with a buddy, one being at the front, trying to get the attention, while the other one goes and flank the enemy. And that way, no matter how big the opponent is, it's going to be stuffed in only a matter of time, because it can't engage two people at the same time. But when should you then use missiles? Because I said that they are horrible, and I don't like them, but still I use them sometimes. Yes, and that is very much true on vehicles that tend to have a gun that has a huge DPM, but very lacking penetration. Now in, for instance, the case of the BMP-2. It has only 115 millimeters of penetration, so it kinda relies on dealing with softly armored opponents such as light tanks, armored fighting vehicles, so on. Or going through the side armor of the vehicles or the rear armor of the vehicles. But if you find yourself in the case where you just simply cannot outmaneuver your opponent, maybe you are alone against one opponent, alone against opponent that knows where you are and is always facing his frontal armor towards you. Well, that is pretty much the case to load the missiles, cause they do have quite a good punch in them. If you are facing opponent that do have a huge amount of protective armor against the missiles, well, that's just a bad luck. Then it goes all again to the shooting at the weak spots and trying to outmaneuver your opponents. If you can't shoot at the weak spots and you can't outmaneuver your opponents, well, I think then the problem has come a lot earlier and you just hadn't noticed it. So at that stage, no matter what you load in your gun, you're stuffed. And that's just the hard reality of it. Now the last thing I want to clarify for people, which was something that I personally did look at quite a long and did not understand how to do it, is that when you do have this screen and you do have your ammunition here, where is the missiles? Because I upgraded the missiles and I was like wondering, where are the missiles? They're in this second pool. The pool 1 is pretty much rounds that are shot from your main gun, I think. And the pool 2 is pretty much the secondary guns. Now, cause the missile is loaded separately to the main gun, I think that is why it is on the second tab. I hope this video has been of use to you, and people coming from World of Tanks might have at the start a bit of a problem kinda understanding the mechanics, because there are no pay to win ammo. There are no premium ammunition, no gold ammunition, nothing like that. You just have different kinds of ammo that work differently in different situations. Sometimes the heat is the way to go and it will do monstrous amounts of damage. But sometimes the heat is just absolutely useless and you're far better off using AP shells. The high explosive is pretty much quite same as in World of Tanks, but maybe arguably a little bit worse if you only think about the damage dealing potential. It rarely does a lot of damage. Extremely rarely. It's quite a big roll of the dice. Sometimes even if you're shooting a person with quite a lot of armor, it can do quite significant amount of damage, and sometimes even at shooting targets with next to no armor, it won't do jack shit. Well then, I think I'm about done with the ammunition right now, and I do go more in depth in the armors, in the vehicle armor on the second video, and discuss more about what kinda different pieces of armor are good against different kind of ammunition. So it kinda works in hand to hand with the ammunition and this video. So thank you so much for watching. I thoroughly hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope I'll see you in the next video.